Good evening, everyone. And can I join Stuart in my welcoming you to this talk this evening? So it's my great honour to be able to introduce Abigail this evening. Professor Abby Powell is Professor of Sociology and Social Policy in the School of Social and Political Sciences. She is Director of Research, as we've heard, at the Eleanor Glanville Centre, and she's also the consultancy lead in the College of Social Science here at the University of Lincoln. So Abby is rightly a very busy person, so thank you for making time for this evening, Abby. Abby is an expert in the gender division of labour in the home and workplace, and Abigail's research is underpinned by her passion for social justice and equality, and I'm sure we will hear about this evening. Over the course of her career, Abigail has attracted research income well over £2 million, working with and delivering research for community, government, not-for-profits and industry. Abigail has published widely in sociology, social policy, management and industrial relations journals, as well as translating, and I think this is a really important point, research findings for a range of audiences, including policymakers and the general public. And Abby is very much at home here, as she grew up in Lincoln and went to school at the local comprehensive in Branston. She studied social and political studies at the University of Sheffield, graduated in 2001, only the second person in her extended family to go to university. She went on to do a master's in research methods and social policy at the University of Nottingham, then joining Lincolnshire County Council as a research officer analysing census data about the county. After working there for a year, Abby decided she was interested in going back to further study, though not exactly sure she tells me what she wants to do. She started applying for research assistant roles and was fortunate enough to get one at Loughborough University, working on an ESRC funded project with Professors Barbara Baggyhole and Andrew Dainty. The project was about the impact of the industrial placement on women engineering students' careers and intentions. The project and her supervisors supported her to do her part-time PhD study whilst working on that project. Her PhD looked at the higher education experience of women engineering students. As the contract was coming to an end, Abby decided to look for opportunities overseas, and having recently been on a holiday to Australia, that was one of the serious contenders. She was looking for an opportunity to work in a research centre where she thought there might be a more collaborative way of working, and this was an opportunity to expand the research topics that she was interested in. The Social Policy Research Centre at UNSW Sydney, University of New South Wales, fitted the bill perfectly, and she moved with her partner to Australia in January 2009. After working on a number of commissioned research projects, she was lucky enough to get what is called a DECRA, a Discovery Early Career Research Award from the Australian Research Council. And this has a really low success rate, so a huge congratulations to Abby for getting one of these. Partway through she was also asked to apply for a job at the Centre for Social Impact, where she was able to develop leadership skills alongside her research, eventually becoming associate professor and co-research director. At the start of 2019, Abby started to get a little homesick and looked for opportunities back in the UK. She said she wasn't in a hurry to move back and was there to wait for the right job. Following an interview for another post here at the university, Abby was offered a role, I suppose in many ways, a collaborative role, working across the Eleanor Glanville Centre, which very much fits with her heart for the social justice and gender issues, which I'm sure we will hear about. The College of Social Science, working with myself on consultancy matters, and also in the School of Social and Political Sciences. So after almost exactly 11 years, Abby and her family moved back to her hometown, starting at work in January 20. So perfect timing just for the lockdown, Abby. But we are delighted that you are here. So can I thank Abby's family and other colleagues from here and elsewhere around the world for joining us this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Abby Powell, who's going to be talking to us on the tenacity of social inequalities. What is the solution?
Thank you, Duncan, and thank you, Stuart, as well. It's really great to be here this evening, and thank you everyone for giving up your evening to be here. I guess it made it a little bit easier since we couldn't be anywhere else because of the new lockdown. But regardless, thank you all for taking the time to come and listen to me this evening. So Duncan's given you a bit of an introduction, but I thought I would say a little bit more about myself and how I ended up where I ended up and what I'm going to talk about today. So generally when people ask me what my research is about, my quick answer is usually that my expertise is on gender equality in home and in the workplace, with a particular focus on male-dominated workplaces. However, this short response really fails to capture my quite diverse research portfolio, which includes a whole host of things, things like financial well-being, social housing, the analysis of the Australian charity sector, social and economic engagement of young people, as well as working on a whole range of evaluation studies too. So compared to some academics, I'm probably fairly unusual in having worked on such a wide array of topics. So before I really get stuck into my talk, I thought it was worth, as I said, explaining this a little bit further. So as Duncan mentioned, I've recently returned to the UK from Australia. And again, as Duncan mentioned, in my time there, I worked at two research centres, the Social Policy Research Centre and the Centre for Social Impact, both at the University of New South Wales. And throughout this time, my academic research focus continued to be around gender equality. But the real bread and butter of these centres, if you like, was on contract research and consultancy for a whole host of organisations, from government departments to philanthropy, to not-for-profit organisations, and to businesses as well. So this led me to have the opportunity to work on a whole range of research topics, and also to lead teams of researchers working across a diverse range of topics, all with a focus on social policy, social purpose, and social inequalities. So when I was invited to do this talk, I started to think about a little bit more closely about what actually is the thread across my research. And I think there were two key elements. So the first is in relation to what motivates me, what I'm interested in. And as Duncan has already mentioned, I'm really passionate about social justice, about equality. And as far back as I can remember, I've always batted for the underdog, so to speak. But my sociological training means that I've also been interested in understanding the structural foundations of inequalities as well. And secondly, when I think about these different topics that I've worked on, the second common thread for most of them is that they're all tenacious problems. And by that I mean that it's often hard to point both the cause of the problems and what solutions might be. If some of these things were simple problems, we would have solved them by now. They wouldn't be problems at all. And I'm going to come on three key things that I've worked on over my career today, and those are youth unemployment, financial exclusion and financial well-being, and gender equality in the workplace. And I'm going to try and keep today mostly a COVID-free space, but I think it's worth noting that each of these issues have all been exacerbated by the COVID world, which we all live in at the moment. So these kinds of tenacious problems might more commonly be referred to as wicked or complex problems. And these are problems that, as I've already kind of suggested, have multiple causes and effects. The cause and effect is not even always clear what's the cause and what's the effect. They tend to be non-linear and they exist within systems. And that's compared to something like a simple problem where the cause and effect is quite clear. So what I want to do in my talk today is tell you about the reasons why I think issues continue to be so tenacious, and also what my thoughts are on why we failed to solve them to date. So what I plan to do is briefly outline the reasons and then illustrate those further, drawing on the examples from my work that I've mentioned. So first, I think that there's been a failure to genuinely understand the nature of the problem. So before you can find the right solution to a problem, you actually diagnose what the problem is. And some of you might be familiar with the famous Einstein quote, which goes along the lines of, if I had an hour to solve a problem, I spend 55 minutes thinking about the problem and 5 minutes thinking about the solution. I think what's important here is that we need to understand the context in which people make decisions and the circumstances in which different people might need support to deal with those problems as well. Secondly, I think there's been a failure to look at the whole system in which a problem sits. Instead, we tend to focus on fixing individuals or just one part of the system. Partly, I think this relates to a desire for quick wins, and it's generally a fact that strategies to fix individuals are much easier to implement than those that are aimed at changing entrenched cultures or norms. And partly, I acknowledge that this is also related to the neoliberal society in which we're in today. But if we only focus on fixing one part of the problem, like individuals, for example, even if our strategy is 100% effective, we only ever fix the limited proportion of the problem. And in reality, I'd actually question the extent to which we can ever truly fix one part of a complex problem without considering the parts of the system. And I'll come back and talk about that a bit more shortly. Related to that, I think there's a tendency to want to attribute change to a single program or intervention. But the reality is that no one single thing is going to fix a wicked problem. It takes multiple people and multiple organisations focused on multiple parts of the problem. So thirdly, I think that there's a failure to acknowledge that genuine change takes time. As I've already mentioned, we tend to focus on quick fixes, quick wins, short-term solutions. Even when we acknowledge that change does take time, there's often still a pressure for quick wins, for able to keep other people like funders on board with what we're doing. But because these aren't simple problems, there are actually relatively few quick wins to be found. And I think that the pressure for quick wins can mean that we lose sight of the complexity of the issues. So I think there really needs to be a recognition that complex problems can't be fixed overnight and that change is a long-term goal. Fourthly, I think there's generally been a failure to test and share what works, in what circumstances and for whom. So often programs and interventions are not evaluated, or they are evaluated, but the findings aren't shared publicly, particularly if an evaluation doesn't have positive results that are often not shared. What this means is that we're not learning lessons about what does work and equally what doesn't work, so that other people, other organisations, government departments, policymakers, for example, can benefit from them. So what I'm going to do now is illustrate this argument a little bit further, drawing on different examples of social inequality in my work, drawing both on my academic work, but also the more applied research that I've been involved with. And I'm going to show you how some of the frameworks or tools that I've used in my work can help us do that. So as I said, I'm going to talk a little bit about youth unemployment first, and move on to talk about financial well-being, and then gender equality in the workplace. So first up, if we take youth unemployment, unemployment rate for 16 to 24-year-olds currently in the UK is around 14%. That's up from 12.7% in the previous quarter and 11.8% at the same time last year. And it's almost definitely, that increase is almost definitely related to COVID, amongst other things. Just to give you an example, put that figure in context, that's almost 3 times what the unemployment rate is for the whole population. So why does it matter? Why should we care about youth unemployment? Well, it affects young people's income. It affects their long-term employability. The longer someone's out of work, the harder it is to get and then sustain work. It affects their social participation. It affects their mental health. It affects housing stability. It affects the families that support them as well. So youth unemployment is a wicked problem because there are multiple causes and effects going on. Sometimes it can even be quite hard to determine which is the cause and which is the effect. So if you take something like housing stability, for example, if you don't have stable housing, it's much harder to sustain employment. However, if you don't have stable employment, it's much harder to sustain stable housing as well. You can see where that challenge around these kinds of issues happens. However, what we've seen both in Australia and the UK, I think, in terms of a policy response from government, is to treat youth unemployment as a relatively simple problem, whereby young people just need to be incentivised or motivated to want to work, or at least to look for work. Most people who actually work in this area, youth organisations, for example, realise that this is only one part of the problem, one part of the puzzle. And I think that a systems thinking approach can help us demonstrate this further. So I'm just going to digress for a moment and tell you a little bit more about what I actually mean when I talk about a system and how systems thinking can help us look at wicked problems. So a classic kind of system is something like a fish tank, or on a larger scale, it might be something like the Great Barrier Reef. And if a new fish comes into the barrier reef, it changes the chemical balance, which can upset existing coral and fishes in there, for example. So a system is something where there are independent but interconnected parts, and they all have a different role to play in the whole. So the behaviour of one part of the system really affects the parts. And systems generally have lots of moving pieces. They have lots of different agents or actors within them, and also lots of different levers. What I mean by levers is that there are levers are actions, interventions that create change in the system. So if we pull a lever in the system, as in if we make a decision or act in a certain way, that creates changes in the system. And those changes can either be intended or unintended. So just to give you a bit more of an example on that, one that you can probably all relate to. So if we think about a supermarket, and supermarkets regularly sell sweets. For the Australians out there, they call sweets lollies. They regularly sell sweets at the checkout. If you're shopping with your kids, you might get to the checkout and your child tells you that they want some sweets. You tell them that they can't have sweets because they're bad for her. But then that decision to tell them that they can't have the sweets results in the unintended effect of your child having a meltdown. That then causes another effect whereby you're so embarrassed, you give in and let your child have the sweets. And consequently, there are bigger unintended effects there too. So you might reinforce your child's behaviour in future. So that's going to happen again every time you take them to the supermarket with you. Ultimately, the more that happens, the more the supermarket is actually likely to put sweets at the end of the checkout because they want you to buy the sweets. So that again is reinforcing what the supermarket does, and means that it becomes self-reinforcing cycle, because then parents have to deal with sweets at the checkout even more. But equally, we can have overlapping systems. And by that I mean, for example, that a sibling who was also at the shops witnesses the behaviour and decides, yes, this could be a useful strategy to try in the circumstances, whether that's at home with the parents or at school, for example. That just explains a little bit more about systems thinking approach. I think this cartoon sums it up really well, particularly in terms of thinking about fixing part of a problem but not the whole of it. So people at the end of the boat are saying, I'm really pleased the hole isn't in our end of the boat, whereas clearly they're all going to go down if the boat sinks. So the systems thinking approach can help us understand the nature of problems like youth unemployment, and then to think about potential solutions that move beyond the individual, who is only one part of the system. So to go back to youth unemployment, something weird has happened with the slide there. Okay. So this circle in the middle is supposed to have a range of labels on it which have disappeared, but as you can see, the first one at the bottom is the individual, and it's moving out that individual's kind of sphere of influence or things that might influence them. So the second one is family and community. Community infrastructures. The next circle out is societal infrastructure and opportunities, and policy, governance, laws, culture, and then the last one is the wider environment. So I think that the systems thinking approach can help us think about what's going on in and around the system of a young person who's unemployed. So it can help us think about things like the labour market in general. So for example, are there actually job vacancies in the labour market that are both appropriate and accessible for young people looking for work? And we know that in today's labour market, getting a job the same as having a decent job and staying in a decent job, and particularly for young people, the labour market is highly casualised and often insecure. And it can also help us see that young people face serious social problems that can make it difficult for them to stay in or find work. So things that I've kind of alluded to already, but things like unstable, unsafe housing, not having enough to eat, not having shoes to wear, not having a washing machine, a lack of social skills, mental health problems, a lack of transport. These things all hinder a young person's ability and capacity to find and hold on to a job. So we can use this knowledge and understanding to help us move towards potential solutions. So instead of thinking about simple solutions like trying to motivate young people to work via a strategy of earn or learn, we need different solutions to address this issue. So we need to do things like match young people with the jobs that are available, support well-structured programs that help young people to develop the skills that they need in today's workforce. And we need to acknowledge that issues which on the surface might seem quite separate, like say mental health and employment, are actually connected. And that therefore it's really important to provide holistic wraparound services that take account of different young people's different circumstances. And I should say that among youth organisations in particular, we are increasingly seeing this kind of response. But what we also need to do is to look at the supply side. For example, thinking about how we can create more jobs and how we can encourage employers to take on young people. Okay, so that was youth unemployment, and I'm now going to move on to talk about the second area of my research that I'm going to talk about today, which is around financial exclusion and financial well-being. So over recent years, there has been a shift to moving away from looking at financial inclusion or exclusion, and people refer to it as one or the other, but it's really the same thing. Financial inclusion or exclusion, it's the same, different sides of the same coin, to looking at financial resilience and financial well-being. And this was really reflected in the research that I was involved in at the Centre for Social Impact. I think that change from exclusion to financial well-being is important because it really acknowledges the multidimensional nature of the problem. So what do these concepts actually mean? So financial inclusion and exclusion are generally fairly narrowly defined as being about access to quite specific financial products. So think having access to a bank account, having access to insurance, and having access to credit. Financial resilience, which is a concept that was developed at the Centre for Social Impact, took that and made it a bit broader. So financial resilience looks at both the internal capabilities of individuals and the external resources and supports that individuals have to draw on in times of financial adversity. Financial well-being takes that a step further still, and it's generally seen as being about individuals and households being able to meet expenses, but also having some money left over. And it's about being in control of one's finances. And it's about being financially secure both now, but also planning for financial security in the future. So as in the case of youth unemployment, there's generally been an overemphasis on fixing the individual in relation to financial exclusion. So, for example, teaching poor people how to budget and manage their finances. However, as the cartoon here shows, if you have no money, it really doesn't matter how good you are at managing budgets, you still have no money. And in fact, most people with little money are excellent at budgeting. They have to know where every last penny goes in order to be able to put food on the table and to pay the rent. And I wonder how many of us here today can say the same. What they are unlikely to do, of course, is to be able to save and put away that little bit extra for a rainy day. For example, when the car or the washing machine breaks down. And you can see that there's a thread here even between the unemployment and financial well-being, because like I said earlier, if you haven't got access to a car, your washing machine breaks and you can't afford to fix it, that makes it really hard to sustain employment as well. So 5 years ago, Australia developed an innovative systems thinking approach to addressing financial well-being, and that was called the Financial Inclusion Action Plan. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that now. So the Financial Inclusion Action Plan is a program that was developed by a not-for-profit called Good Shepherd Microfinance in collaboration with my own organisation at the time, the Centre for Social Impact, and also EY Australia, initially with some support from government funding. And the initiative brought together a number of quite diverse organisations who committed to practical actions and cross-sector collaboration with the long-term goal of improving Australia's financial well-being. And I've just put some logos, some of the members up on the screen here. Particularly interesting about FIAP is that despite the fact that there was some government funding, it was a ground-up initiative led by the member organisations themselves. And I think the range of organisations is quite interesting as well. So Australia's big banks were signed up, as well as education institutions, insurance companies, utilities companies, and a whole host of charitable organisations as well. So as part of the programme, each member organisation has to come up with its own organisational-based action plan. And at the end of 2018, there were over 580 committed actions from 30 organisations, and that's continued to grow since then. The programme included funding for research to actually examine the nature of the problem more broadly, so the Centre for Social Impact was involved in doing some of that research. But member organisations also have to examine what the problem looks like for them and for their organisation, and to really critically think about what role they can play in addressing the problem as a precursor to actually developing their own plans. So on the next slide, I've included some examples of the plans of action that were included in the organisational FIAPs. I'm not going to read all of those out, but What I will say is that some of these organisations, admittedly, would have been implementing at least some of these actions as part of their corporate social responsibility plans anyway. By coming together as a community of practice, there was an opportunity to share information about what works and equally what didn't work. And I think sometimes the learning about what doesn't work is useful than learning about what does work, but also to challenge the role of different actors in the system. So to give you an example there, banks, you might think, don't have an obvious role to play in something like addressing domestic violence, but financial abuse is often a key part of coercive control. So through FIAP, the banks have started working with charity organisations to understand things like the right kinds of questions to ask of their customers in order to identify people that might be at risk of domestic violence and financial abuse. Working with the charities to put programmes in place that can actually support customers fleeing domestic violence, and also working with the charity organisations to ensure that they can refer customers that they do identify as at risk to appropriate services, because obviously offering that kind of support is outside of the remit of the bank. They can act as a facilitator and referral. The programme isn't perfect and there's definitely room for improvement. For example, it doesn't, and it probably can't address some of the bigger parts of the system, like the overall, what's happening in the overall labour market or around government policy, for example. However, what I think it's good at is that it delivers on a couple of other aspects. So firstly, it has recognised that achieving financial well-being is a long endeavour, and that impact is likely to take 10 plus years to achieve. And secondly, it's built evaluation into the model so that there's a continual reflection on what works for whom and lessons that can be learnt along the way. And that evaluation is happening at the programme level rather than at the organisational level, recognising that individual organisations have a role to play. That meaningful change will be based on what all of the organisations are doing and not the actions of a single organisation. Okay. So I'm going to talk now about gender equality in the workplace. I'm going to draw here specifically on examples from construction and engineering sectors where I've done most of my research. I think it's fair to say that these are reflected in other fields too. So just a brief bit of background. What do I mean by workplace gender equality and why does it matter? So it really refers to the persistent barriers that women face in the workplace. It refers to gender-specific biases. It refers to overt and covert sexism and to gendered practices. And by gendered practices, I mean things like expectations of presenteeism and total availability, which incidentally our research has shown is bad for both women and men, and also things like the gender pay gap. And the effect of this is that women often have fewer opportunities than men in the workplace, and that impacts on their status, their opportunity for progression, and their broader well-being, amongst other things. Positively, the importance of addressing gender equality, I think, is broadly accepted. Various studies now have shown that there's a strong business case for having a diverse workforce. It's also a matter of social justice. So why should women be treated differently to men? But the acceptance of this issue, or the acceptance of gender inequality as an issue now, is also clear from the numerous initiatives that have been implemented by both government, industry associations, and individual organisations over the last 50 odd years. But at least in the industries that I'm looking at, these initiatives have had relatively little substantive impact. And in fact, in Australia, the proportion of women in the construction industry has decreased over recent years. So I thought what I'd do now is talk briefly about some of the solutions or initiatives that have been offered today to address gender inequality in the workplace, and talk a little bit about what the challenges with those have been. On a positive note, I think what's good is that the solutions or the initiatives that have been posed do look at different parts of the system. I think where they're lacking is probably thinking about how those different parts of the system actually interact together. So as I said, I'll talk you through these briefly. There's been a major focus on solutions at the micro or individual level. And historically, this is focused on strategies that might be referred to as fix for women. So things like mentoring for women, women's networks, leadership training for women. And myself and others argue that this has really had limited effect because it assumes that women just need to lean in a bit more. They just need to want it a bit more, or they just need to develop the skills for dealing with the sexist man in the workplace. They don't in any way alter the wider gender structures in which gender inequality exists. This is an example of a micro level solution that we're increasingly seeing is what I have called fixing the perpetrators. And this includes things like unconscious bias training for all staff within an organisation. And the jury is really still out on the effectiveness of solutions like that, largely because one-off training events are unlikely to shift deep-rooted beliefs. People quickly return to their default behaviours and ways of rating. There have also been a large number of meso or organisational level responses, and this includes things like the introduction of parental leave and flexible work practices. And these things tend to be regulated by government to some extent, for example, with things like the right to request flexible work. But often, even in male-dominated workplaces, large companies at least do go beyond the minimum provisions. What we found in our research, though, is that these sometimes have a fairly limited effect, partly because while they're pitched as gender neutral, so parental leave, not maternity leave, and flexible work is usually open to everybody, they inadvertently often embed gender differences since they are taken up predominantly by women. And that means that the use and take-up of those policies can then actually be used to lead to further discrimination. Lastly, there have also been some macro-level responses, and this includes things like mandatory reporting on the gender pay gap. And while this tackles part of the story, our research shows that these kinds of policy measures are often undermined by informal practices, or what some people might refer to as organisational culture. So at this point, we've started to use other tools to help decipher and understand different layers of the system and how they work together, and why formal initiatives such as the ones that I've just outlined have had relatively little impact. So the framework that we've drawn on most is called feminist institutionalism. And this framework emerged from another called new institutionalism. And until fairly recently, it's been used predominantly to look at gender in politics. This framework really helped us to understand the failure of those kinds of formal initiatives in a number of ways. So firstly, it's helped reveal both the formal and informal rules that are in play. So what do I mean by formal and informal rules? Formal rules are the things like policies, strategies, initiatives, even things like the law, but they're the kind of things that I've just described in relation to the solutions to gender inequality that have been to date in terms of the workplace. Informal rules, on the other hand, are the unwritten yet taken for granted practices, norms and narratives within workplaces. It's the kind of how things are done around here that everyone has to learn when they start a new job. Secondly, it's helped us to demonstrate how informal rules can work to undermine formal rules to achieve gender equality. So, for example, even if a company policy means that you can work flexible hours, if your colleagues persistently take the piss out of you because you arrive on the construction site after 8 o'clock in the morning and you leave before 4 p.m., you might not want to continue with those. You might not want to continue using those flexible work practices. On the other hand, it might be that you have to continue with using those practices because you've got to take the kids to school, you've got to pick them up, for example. However, other people witnessing the behaviour and the response that you get, if they don't need to use those flexible work practices, they won't, because they've seen what the informal rules are. Thirdly, it's helped us to detect which rules are robust and which ones are weak. We found this to be absolutely critical because a lot of rules specifically around gender equality tend to be quite weak, by which I mean that they're not enforced by companies and individuals are not sanctioned if they don't follow them. Fourthly, it's helped us identify competing rules. So, for example, in the construction industry, many contracts historically have had penalties attached to them if they're not completed either on time or on budget. And this has helped to support informal practices and narratives around long work hours and total availability. And in fact, this is actually also a good example of a really strong formal rule. One so strong that even as contracts have moved away from following this kind of penalty framework, the informal practices have remained. And lastly, it's shown us that in addition to there being rules about gender, there are also rules with gendered effects. What do I mean by that? Well, part of our research involved examining the policy documents of the organisations we were researching, so the formal rules that these organisations had. And when we started the research, our intent was to look at policies and practices that we thought related specifically to gender. So things like the company's gender equality policy, diversity policies, policies about flexible work and parental leave. But it soon became clear that we needed to look at a much greater range of formal rules, including, for example, things like the construction contract, which I've just mentioned, as well as recruitment and promotion practices. So this is not to say that there isn't a role for top-down solutions, but that I think that top-down solutions often won't work by themselves, particularly if they're not robust enough, and that there's a need to understand greater understanding of what else is going on in the system as well. So in relation to the construction industry specifically, we've made a number of recommendations on how to address gender equality through our research. And most importantly, I think what's clear is that a multidimensional approach is needed. Some of our specific recommendations have included things like changing the narrative, so stopping the reward and promotion of excessive hours, standardising work hours, removing weekend work, demonstrating no tolerance to sexism. There also needs to be accountability for gender equality and for diversity more broadly, both in terms of the enforcement of the rules, but also making managers accountable, making it part of their KPIs, for example. And then in terms of a multi-pronged approach, we've supported putting gender on the tender. So one of the largest contractors of construction work is the government. And the government could easily make action around gender equality a mandatory component for organisations submitting tenders for work. So I'm coming to the end now, and to return to my original question, what is the solution to these tenacious or wicked problems of social inequality? Well, hopefully I've alluded to some of these along the way, and the failures that I've highlighted, I think, point to a flip side for solutions too. So firstly, I think we need to do better at understanding the nature of the problem and how different parts of the system shape the problem in order to then understand what levers we can pull for change. So frameworks like systems thinking and feminist institutionalism are two of the tools that I've used in my work to help achieve this. Secondly, I think we need to address multiple parts of the system at the same time. It's not enough just to focus on fixing individuals or to look only at top-down policy approaches. We need to do multiple things at the same time. We need to keep reflecting on the problem to see how different of the system, like the formal and informal rules, interact when we pull different levers. And thirdly, I think that we need to measure progress, share findings about what works and what doesn't work so that others can build on this learning. And then finally, I think that we need to acknowledge that there might not be any quick wins, that change takes time. Change takes time. Ultimately, in fact, there might not be a complete solution, but we can do more to develop shared understandings and potential solutions and really think about how we can work together across systems towards that. So finally, I'd just like to acknowledge that the research that I've drawn on throughout this talk is thanks to the research teams, co-authors, funders, and the partners that I've had the opportunity to work with throughout my career. Often in academia, we're rewarded and acknowledged very much as individuals. Almost all of my achievements have been the result of collaboration. And again, something strange has happened with the slides here. So this has cut off half of the people that should be on there. So I'm sorry about that. But I really want to thank every one of the individuals and organisations that I've worked with throughout my career. And then lastly, I want to do a few special shout outs. So to my family and friends, but especially my partner, Lee, who always supports me in my work. My little boy, Teddy, who's in this photo here. And to my mum and dad, who are always there for me. I've also been very fortunate to have some really quite special mentors and sponsors throughout my career. And these people have given me some great advice. They've asked me critical questions, critical times, and they've really pushed me to do my best as well. And alongside that, I've had a number of colleagues who I'm lucky enough to now call close friends, who have definitely kept me sane along the journey. And I look forward to now making more of those now that I'm at Lincoln as well. So thank you to all of you, and thank you for taking the time to listen today.
Thank you, Abby, for a fascinating and really thought-provoking talk. I think it's really, really important stuff. I do have an apology to offer now, because usually at this point you would be listening to the applause dying off. I'm afraid you just have to imagine what's going on in the background. We are getting some applause in the chat. So in terms of questions, what I'd like to do is ask you to type your questions into the chat, and then I'll read them out so that Abby doesn't have to multitask. In the time remaining, we'll answer as many as we can. So thank you. Okay, so the first one, I guess, is perhaps a comment more than a question. Gail says, of the 77 people here, only around 12 are men. Is it time we called out that lack of engagement by men? And is it part of the gender equality issue?
Yes, Gail, I think absolutely. I think it so often happens, particularly in my area of research around gender equality, presenting at conferences and so on. Often you are talking to the converted, not those that need converting. So yeah, I think that's definitely part of the problem. I think the other important point, and Gail, we've spoken about this before, but gender is something that both men and women have. It's not just a women's issue, and particularly in terms of our research in the construction industry. I mentioned this a little bit briefly, but what we've found is that a lot of these gendered practices are actually really negative for men as well as for women. So really, really common in the construction industry is this notion of presenteeism, total availability, working really excessively long hours. And that's having a really bad impact on men's lives as well as women's lives.
Thank you. So next we have Kay. That's brilliant, Abby. She says, thank you very much. Can you tell us about a time when you've had a lot of pushback around equality and how you've dealt with that?
I wouldn't say I've faced a lot of pushback. It's interesting when we were getting companies to on board with us for the construction project that I worked on. There were a couple that I think didn't want to be involved because they thought they'd already solved the problem. And then it was interesting working with the companies as well. I remember when we did a public talk when we finished the project, and the two companies that we worked with were both in the audience, and we had various quotes up on the screen about how bad things were from different people. And independently at the end of the talk, both companies came up to us and said, but those quotes weren't from our company, they were the other company, weren't they? So even though they were working with us and knew this was an issue, yeah, there is a lot of denial as well, because everybody thinks that they are doing a good job. I don't know that entirely answers the question, but I think it's just continuing to try and work with those organisations as best you can. They were at the table, so that was a start.
So next we have Ideni, who has asked, could the concept of feminism, oh, it's moving in front of me. Could the concept of feminist institutionalism be extended to understand gendered racism in workplaces?
Simple answer, I think yes. I presented quite a simple version of the theory, but I think it's been a really useful tool, and to really unpick and understand how some of those different rules together work, interact, support each other, undermine each other, both formal and informal rules. And so I think in terms of racism and gendered racism in the workplace, the rules that you're looking at might be a little bit different. I definitely think it's a framework that could be used there, yes.
And Stephanie would like to know, is there really a boat with a leak that we all sit in? Or are there others in private planes that take off and leave us to do the bailing out?
Quite possibly, Stephanie, yes. I'm not sure I can say much more than that.
Sue asks, wicked problems take time to resolve. Is this at odds with the fast-paced prototyping good enough world that we currently inhabit?
Yeah, I think it definitely is, and I mentioned, there's often a pressure, particularly from funders. People want to see quick results. Well, not just from funders. In fact, I remember working with a collaborative initiative in Western Sydney where they were looking at child well-being, and members of the community were involved in that as well. And people living with these complex problems, they're equally frustrated because they've seen multiple people coming in and trying to fix the problem for them and things not changing. So they want fast change as well. So it's a difficult thing to negotiate, and I don't think there's an easy answer to that. But yeah, I think it is at odds somewhat with that fast-paced, want quick results.
I guess in some senses that is a wicked problem itself, right?
Yes, it is, isn't it?
So I think we have time for one or two more. Christian asks, if a wicked social problem is one with multiple causes, and a problem to be seen and approached as part of a system, are there any non-wicked social problems?
I'm just thinking about, even within this, like thinking about some things like youth unemployment, for example. I think that there can be, as a whole, youth unemployment is a complex, wicked problem, but sometimes there are simple things within that. So if someone's car or washing machine has broke down, and that means they haven't got the transport to get to work, or they can't wash their uniform. Those are actually things that don't need a complex solution and can be fixed quite quickly, but it might take some time to get to the root of what that problem is. So someone might be embarrassed to say, actually, we haven't got a washing machine at our house, for example, or I can't afford a new pair of shoes. So you might go round in circles a bit before you get there. I think that's an example of where we think of something that is quite complex, but occasionally there are some quite simple solutions within there.
Cool. So unfortunately, I think we can only squeeze one more question in, mostly because I don't want Abby to be exhausted. So I'm going to pick out one from Faye. The failure of gender equality policies are often framed as ineffective, but can they actually be damaging to the project of pursuing equality? And where do we draw the line between ineffective and damaging?
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and particularly when we think about some of the solutions that I described, like the fixing the women things, and even policies where, like I said, they're framed as gender neutral, but can end up further embedding inequalities. I think part of the issue there is that we actually don't often know. So social policy is a little bit better at evaluation than the workplace side of things, but there's very little evaluation of actually what works and what is effective and what isn't effective. So we might know, like, qualitatively or anecdotally, but there's not any hard or fast evidence of what works because people don't share that knowledge. And I think partly that's in terms of companies wanting to maintain a competitive edge over each other, so they don't necessarily want to share things. But I guess my main point there is I think we need to do more to actually understand what is ineffective and what isn't.
Thank you, Abby. So thank you once again. And I think that's a lovely note to leave on, that we should be sharing best practice far more, and we can all profit from that rather than being selfish in that sense. I would really like to thank you. I think it's been brilliant. I'd like to thank you as the audience for sticking with us. It's our first online, and I think it's been absolutely brilliant. So we are recording this, so if you wish to go over it again or you missed some details, you'll be able to find it in a few days' time on the LIAS website or the EGC website within university. If you have any questions about that, please do email us and we'll point you in the right direction. I'm hoping that Abby is reading all the messages of thanks coming up in the chat.
I am. Thank you. That's very lovely, everyone.
And I'd just like to end by saying that we have another inaugural in 1 or 2 weeks' time. I've got so caught up in the lecture that I've forgotten the details, but we will post that up on our website and circulate it to our mailing list. If you'd like to join the EGC or the LIAS events mailing list, then please do let us know. Oh, there we go, as if by magic. Abigail Woods is talking on the 25th of November between 6 and 7. So thank you very much, everybody. I hope you enjoy the rest of the evening, and think of Abby's talk when you're watching the fireworks and celebrating that way. Good night, everyone.
Watching the US election results then.
Try and keep it positive here.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.